Yeah, well, that is a fun one, despite the ominous lyrical content. And speaking of lyrical content, you mentioned this a minute ago. In 2009, you did an album of Bob Dylan covers called Dylan Different. Standouts for me on that would include your versions of Subterranean Homesick Blues and Knocking on Heaven's Door. What inspired that project?
I started, maybe in the early 2000s. I'm not sure why. I think I came up with that arrangement of Subterranean Homesick Blues first, and I started playing it on my gigs, and particularly my gigs in Europe. I tend to stretch out a lot more in Europe than I do in the States. The audiences there, I don't know how to describe it. Maybe they're just more relaxed. They're more comfortable in jazz clubs. The jazz clubs are not so expensive, and they're not so much about selling product. It's an experience. Anyway, a lot of people responded to that. And of course, I remembered Subterranean Homesick Blues from the 60s when Dylan first recorded it. And the lyrics were remarkable. And the fact that he could do this, stuck with me. But I would never have recorded a Dylan song if I didn't think I had a unique angle on it. Because, that's like recording a Miles Davis song. If you don't have a angle on it, there's no reason to do it. He's done it. A lot of people have done it. And I came up with this angle on Dylan's songs where I didn't reharmonize them totally like a jazz musician might. But harmonically, his songs were so simple that I was able to reharmonize them just enough and articulate the lyrics in a particular way that people hadn't heard them before, so that when I played them in clubs, people would come up to me and say, man, that was the first time I understood the words to that song, and it was really a great groove. So that's what set me off on that. And a year after having started playing them in clubs, we made that record in France with musicians from Switzerland and France, because I particularly wanted it to have kind of a haunted feeling to it, a kind of a magical feeling. I didn't want to just go in the studio with a bunch of great guys. I wanted it to feel like it was from some other place, some other country. And so anyway, that's the evolution of that.
And that's one thing I like about your catalog. It's not just like the same thing over and over again. As we've heard, you just follow your muse wherever it leads you. And if it leads you into Dylan covers with Swiss musicians, that's just where you go. And, I'm really glad you used the word haunted, because I'd feel remiss if I didn't ask you about the haunted piano of Garcia Lorca.
Oh, yes, the haunted piano. That was quite an event. Well, that was in 1998, I think. And in fact, it came about because Leo was studying at the university in Sevilla in Spain, and I had gone to visit him, and then the two of us went to Granada with Georgie Fame, and we played a gig there. And while we were there, we met a woman named Laura Garcia Lorca, who was the niece of the great poet Federico Garcia Lorca. And through a series of meetings and hanging out, she eventually invited me to come and participate in the celebration of the 100th anniversary of Lorca's birth. Of course, Lorca himself was killed when he was like 36 years old, I think. By Franco's, well, not by Franco, by the fascists. It was during the Civil War. And so I studied all of Lorca's poetry, and I recast it as music. And we went back to Granada, and we were going to play this concert outside of Lorca's family home. The concert started at 11 o'clock at night. It was a moonlit night. And in Granada, there are these caves that you can see in the hillsides where the flamencos and the gypsies have lived for generations. And so it was kind of a magical experience. And then Laura herself decided that to really make a tribute to her uncle, I needed to play his private piano, his personal piano, which she had carried out of the house and into the garden. Now, this is a piano that was from the 19th century or early 20th century. It wasn't really meant to be played in a concert. It was a parlor piano, they called it. And this very piano, when they came looking for Lorca, when the fascists came in the 1930s, They tore this piano apart because they thought Lorca was a communist and that he had a radio transmitter hidden in the piano and that he was communicating with the communists, with the Russians. So this was a very important artifact, iconic piano in Spain. And to have taken it out of the museum, his house had turned into a museum, and put it in the garden and let me play it was quite an event. There was a lot of controversy about that, but Laura was very clear that she wanted me to play it. And there absolutely was something haunted about this piano. And I don't mean that there were ghosts in the piano. What I mean is that this instrument had a personality and a history that just could not be denied. It was unlike any other piano I'd ever played. And it created an atmosphere. So the music that we played was kind of outside of the realm of a regular concert. I don't know how else to experience it, except that it did feel haunted. That was a magical night.
Now, did you find out after the gig that somebody had recorded the show without your knowledge?
That's exactly right. Yeah, we didn't intend to record it at all. I mean, I wouldn't have been so confident to want to record something like that. Right. But the sound man, for whatever reason, God bless him, had run a DAT, a digital recording, off of the board of the concert. And in fact, he gave it to me at the end, and I threw it in, my bag, whatever. And I forgot about it for about a month or two. And I was back home, and I saw this thing. And I said, oh, that's right, he recorded it. And I put it on. And there was this sound. When it starts, there's this sound when it starts. We're out there. It's 11 o'clock at night. There's like 300 people sitting out in this garden. And the concert starts with this low rumbling pedal point. And it's just sort of supposed to signify, something on the horizon about to rise. But the bass he's bowing the bass, and I'm playing this thing, and the drums are rumbling. And it just sort of sets off this remarkable mood that we managed to maintain for an hour. The music is interesting, but the mood is really something.
And the reason I mention all this is it was recorded without your knowledge. It was a completely unique event. When you found out it was recorded, I'm sure you probably had low expectations. Then you heard it, and you've released this. This is something people can go get.
I released it. People can go get it, and it was nominated for a Grammy. So it really moved a lot of people.
Well, thanks for telling that story. That's awesome. And, I didn't play anything from that. I didn't play the Dylan because, we can't play everything. Hey, we all end up with a 5-parter here. But one of the last things I want to touch on as we kind of enter the home stretch, I have to say that for a guy who was never very interested in rock music, you ended up pretty connected to it.
I know.
In the early 60s, you joined a blues band called the Fabulous Ardells that featured 2 future superstars, Steve Miller and Boz Scaggs. You were roommates for a while with the legendary producer Glyn Johns. And your 1970 debut album featured Jim Keltner and Charlie Watts on drums. Jesse Ed Davis and Peter Frampton were your guitar players. You did work with Steve Miller a little bit. You were the co-writer of his song Space Cowboy. As I said, you followed your muse and your passion in a different direction. I just find it kind of funny that you had a connection to and access to, all these accomplished rock players that, so many others would have loved to be in your position. And you're still like, yeah, I think I'll pass.
Yeah. Well, the first time I heard Steve and Boz in this band, I was 19 years old. They were 19 years old. And they were playing this Texas shuffle, this Jimmy Reed, T-Bone Walker kind of shuffle, which was fabulous. I mean, I just loved it. I was a big fan of Art Blakey and Horace Silver. And there's a very similar feel, very similar shuffle feel. So falling into that was relatively easy. But that wasn't rock and roll as such. That was like playing, blues, a specific kind of Southern blues. When it turned into rock and roll toward the end of the 60s, I became much less interested in the music. It didn't feel as good to me, rock and roll, as the blues and shuffle. And when I was living in England, I was going to graduate school there. And at one point, Steve and Boz and that band, this was 1967, the Steve Miller Band, they came to England to make the first record. And so because I was in England, I would hang out at the studio with them, and I recorded on a bunch of tracks. And that's where I met Glyn Johns. He was the producer of that record. And subsequently, Glenn hired me to do other sessions. And one of the sessions I got to play on was actually a Rolling Stones session. I don't believe that it ever found its way onto a record, but I wouldn't know because it wasn't really a song. It was like a few chords that we spent 6 hours hammering out in the studio one night. But they were all there. Keith and Mick and Charlie and, Bill Wyman, everybody was there. And I said, when I first met Charlie Watts, I went to his house and he was listening to Miles Davis's Kind of Blue. And I was so knocked out. I didn't know he was a jazz fan at the time. And I said, Charlie, I'm so happy to hear you listening to Miles, because I got to be honest with you, I don't listen to the Rolling Stones very often. And he said to me, well, that's all right, mate. Neither do we. and I realized that, even the hardest of hardcore rock and roll musicians are probably jazz fans. Every musician knows that jazz is the highest form. And rock and roll is really a commercial undertaking. I mean, you can take it seriously if you want, and there's a lot to be said about the innovations of Jimi Hendrix and many others. But in fact, when a rock and roll musician starts to age, the first thing he or she tends to think about is, how can I make a jazz record? and it's true. And so I was never particularly seduced by the rock and roll idiom, although I was very happy to be able to play it, and I did my best when I did play it. I didn't look down at it at all. It wasn't my strength. It wasn't my strong point.
Yeah, it'd be like somebody being in a country band where they don't feel authentic playing that music, and somebody else only feeling authentic playing country. I've met those type of people.
That's right. That's exactly right.
Yeah, I just find it interesting that you're like palling around with Charlie Watts and, Frampton's on my album and this and that. And instead of having a rock career with all these connections, you're like, but we don't feel too sorry for you because we heard, you had Steve Gadd and Jerry Hay, and Michael Brecker. You made the right choice. And sort of speaking about not feeling sad for you, the track I wanted to go out with was the title track from the album you mentioned, Don't Cry for No Hipster. Now, I have to point out, though, for a guy as literate as you are, I hope you realize you employed a double negative.
Well, I thought about that. And seriously, because, I don't gratuitously, try to use language that implies I'm not educated. I am educated. But there was no way to say, don't cry for any hipster, or don't cry for a hipster. Don't cry for no hipster was the only way it would come out. And I actually talked to Leo. I said, I'm going to have to name it Don't Cry for No Hipster. And I know it's a double negative. What do you think? He said, yeah, it's okay. So that's why we did it.
Of course, because that's what's great about lyrics. Something that in the context of just a written word that doesn't necessarily work, it can be perfectly fine in the context of a recording. The one I always think of is there's a Stevie Wonder song called Do I Do.
Yep.
And there's a line in there where he says, I don't care how long it might take, because I know the woman for me you I'll make. And you know what he means, but it's like a grammatical nightmare, right?
It's terrible. Stevie Wonder is not a great lyricist. I'm sorry. He's a brilliant songwriter, but his lyrics are kind of just thrown together.
I think what he does is, a lot of us write temp lyrics. And then he throws it in as a temp, because when he says that, what he's saying. I'm going to make you the woman for me, but it has to fit the rhythm. It has to end on the rhyme, and so you just have. But that whole track was kind of a throwaway. It was never meant to be anything, I think, other than a jam. So he wasn't taking that seriously. But you have to respect the humor and creativity behind that sort of thing. I remember Steve Martin was on the David Letterman show, and he says, I was listening to a song on the radio today, Dave, and I don't think I could ever be like a rock guy. He goes, and he starts singing like, I've been through the desert on a horse with no name. It felt good to be out of the rain. In the desert, you can't remember your name, for there ain't no one for to give you no pain. I mean, talk about a grammatical nightmare. Like there's like 12 things wrong with that sentence. But
Yep.
And actually, speaking of humor, I didn't mention the name of the track we opened with. I just mentioned the album title, but the name of that song was Lust, and that doesn't really seem to fit the mood of the number. So what was the thinking behind that title?
Well, that's an interesting question. That was a little instrumental groove that I had been playing in clubs with my band, and we recorded it, and it didn't really have a name. And, I don't know why I named it Lust. I don't understand sometimes why things just pop out of my head. But anyway, that was just a throwaway. There was no specific reason for that. It was a good idea at the time. That's all I can think of.
Well, sometimes with instrumentals, it might not matter as much, but when you think of
Right.
lust, you think of passion and fire, and that's like a chilled out kind of group.
I was totally chilled out. I know.
Well, here's what I think is the humorous part. I bought that track on iTunes, and as it was downloading, I glanced up at the screen and it said "Purchasing Lust."
That's good.
Yeah, well, I found that funny, but what really struck me as funny is if anybody ever asked me if I'd ever paid money for a hooker, I could say no, but in 2017, I did purchase Ben Sidran's Lust.
That's good.
So I mentioned we're going to close with that Don't Cry for No Hipster, but as a little bonus, since that's a studio recording, I want to play one more live one after that. We'll give them like a little 2-song medley. And this is from a 2008 album that you recorded in Madrid in recognition of your 100th night, playing a particular venue, Cien Noches. 100 nights at the Cafe Central.
Yeah, and the Cafe Central is this great club that's been there for, I don't know, maybe 30 years. It's Madrid's premier jazz club. And I started playing there in the year 2000. And I'm going back this year as well. I mean, what does this say? So this is 18 years I've been going back. And we play either a week or 2 weeks there. So either 7 nights or 14 nights. So by this point, I've probably played there 170, 180 nights. But when that record was recorded, actually, I think the club owner reminded me that it was going to be my 100th night of playing there. And that's a lot, That's a third of a year practically of playing in the room. And I had been playing a lot of Hammond organ at that time. So I said, well, look, I want to come and I want to play B3 organ. And since I've never recorded a record playing organ, and I've played organ since I was in college, I love playing Hammond. And so I said, let's make it special. It's my 100th night, and I'm going to play the Hammond organ. And so I put together a special band, and we went and did it, and we recorded live in the room. It was great. It's a great feeling record, too. One of the things, like you commented that all my records tend to have a different premise, and that's absolutely right. If I've done one kind of a record, I will never go back and redo that. I mean, The Cat in the Hat was a particular kind of record. I would never go back and try to make another record like that, or like Cool Paradise, or like Cien Noches for that matter. But what is consistent about all these recordings and the different styles is the mood. They all have a certain kind of a mood that you can summarize any number of ways. But I like the way that writer you quoted said it, where it's carefully produced and casually performed, because that's kind of my mood.
Yeah, he actually said expertly, but carefully also works. And I'm glad you mentioned the organ. That's actually the exact reason I grabbed this one. We've heard you play acoustic and electric piano so far, but on this one, you're playing the organ. How does switching up the instrument affect your technique? Do you feel like like the different instrument requires different chops in a sense?
Oh, definitely. And one of the things about playing organ is, you're playing the bass simultaneously. Yeah. There are pedals that you can play bass lines on, or somebody like myself who's not skilled at the pedals, I have to play the bass in my left hand while I'm comping and or soloing in my right hand. So it's a particular release, mental release. You can't worry about it. You just have to feel it. And because Leo and I have played together so often, just duos sometimes, organ and drums, we got a really good feel together on this thing. And so I was confident that it would come out okay. But it's a very different instrument, and the chops are different. The technique is very different from an acoustic piano. There's no question.
Yeah, I was thinking Bach's day when he played a harpsichord, and there was no sustain at all, so there's a lot of trills. And now on a piano, you can hit a note, and it'll sustain for a while, but it'll eventually die out. But on the organ, you can hold a note down, it'll just stay down, and sustain forever. And so that's what I find. The name of the song I'm going to play is Cave Dancing. And
oh, yeah.
You really don't even need to say anything about that, because I think over the course of that, you explained pretty thoroughly what that's about. And so after we hear Don't Cry for No Hipster, which is the slow and sort of melancholic type thing, then we'll hear this, like you said, funky, energetic, live in Spain kind of organ groove. And, I kind of feel sorry for the listeners in a way, because there's so many great albums to go check out. Where do you start? But I just wanted to leave this upbeat. And speaking of all that material, again, I encourage everybody to visit bensidran.com. The information is there about the interviews we spoke about that you did with the jazz greats, your solo albums you've produced for other artists. And when I said earlier about reading your books and having you on again, that was no idle threat.
Let's do it. You got it. Let's do it.
So everybody, you can save your tears. We don't have to cry for no hipster.
That's it.
No, don't cry for no hipster. He knew what he signed up for. The look on the field, that run-down appeal, the passing ship, the distant shore. No, don't cry for no hipster. He saw the writing on the wall. And it gives him hope, just another slippery slope. A deeper truth he can't recall. And when young becomes old, cool turns to cold. That's when we'll see if the truth set him free. Until then, don't cry for no hipster. He had his day, he had his night. Let's call it what it is. In a life like his, it's usually wrongs that make it right. Say I'm tired of being so hip. It's like waiting for a ship that don't never come in. But check out his grin. Don't cry for him. No, don't cry for no hipster. He's got his hat, he's got his cane. And in a world so square, with disasters everywhere, if you can laugh at life, you're through. But if you have to cry, If you have to cry, then make it tears of joy, because he's here and then he's gone, and gone is one thing he can do. Last night we had a bunch of people in here dancing. People say, now wait a minute, I thought this was supposed to be a jazz club. That's right. If you had been up in Harlem in 1927 in the jazz club, you would have seen some people dancing. And if you were up here last night, you would have seen some people dancing. This music is made for dancing. Every jazz musician from Ornette Coleman to John Coltrane to Louis Armstrong, Duke Ellington, Count Basie, Charlie Parker played for dancing. Played for dancing. Now, rhythm is a hypnotic thing. It's like hypnosis. And it certainly precedes language. I'm talking 100,000 years ago. It's probably the start of all religion. People getting together around a fire 100,000 years ago and grooving. Something magic happens when the groove enters the room. In the sanctified church, they call it calling the spirit down. Calling the spirit down. Here in Spain, we like to think it's bringing the spirit up from the ground. Because in Spain, the spirit, also known as the duende, comes up out of the ground. We got that from Garcia Lorca, who told us, the duende does not come from up above. It's not like a little angel who visits you from time to time, descending with its love. The duende comes from the ground. So, when you think with your feet instead of your head, it's always more profound, whether it's never said. And I personally like to imagine 100,000 years ago back in that cave around that fire, those people look just like us. That's not that long ago in the world of evolution. Oh, sure, several ice ages have come and gone, but back then, they knew how to carry on. So in the spirit of the Great Spirit, in the language of the blues, in the original communication, in the delivery of the real news, as Leadbelly said, we're going to deliver one more dance unto you. Goes something like this. Look at it this way. It's a thesis, then it's the antithesis, and finally, the synthesis. If you must, left hand, right hand, no hands. Now imagine the fire is burning in the middle of the cave. One by one, the people get up. Start moving in a circle, doing that little shuffle dance that people have always done. First they point up at the sky, then they point down at the ground. Before there was language, the groove was coming down. And when people get bound together by time, not just time as we think of it in a clock, I'm talking about the time that's stored in a tree or maybe stored in a rock. Time, existence, it's all we got. That's what we're talking about. Tell me you can't see them there in that cave. Ecstatic. They got no bedtime in the cave. You see what I'm saying? All day, all night. Ecstatic. Alive. The groove is alive in the people. The groove is alive in the people. And the people are alive in the groove. It has ever been that way and shall always be. Gracias. Buenas noches.